everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. We're kicking off Season 8 with a series of exceptionally eerie stories, and keeping this intro short and sweet. First and foremost, maybe most importantly, thank you all for your continued support, and cheers to many, many more seasons. Tonight I bring you terrifying encounters with cryptids and tales from beyond the grave, because whether it's encountering something capable of devouring one's entire being, or some unexplained encounter with something more or less physical, your story belongs here. And if those are the kinds of stories that you want to hear, well, you've come to the right place. So, let's get started, shall we? This is a weird memory that I have with my grandma during the end of her life that kind of scared me. I was young, and such a contrastive point of view was far beyond my understanding. The conversations between the doctors and my parents went way over my head. I knew what cancer was, and I knew Grandma Yuki had a lot of it in her bones. She was sick, and that's why we were staying in the hospital with her. Years later, my comprehension of what Alzheimer's and dementia was would give me more perspective of why my grandma acted the way she did sometimes. Grandma Yuki was in her late 80s, and for days at a time, my dad and I would sleep on cots in her hospital room, because the doctors would tell us that she would be passing away soon. This routine would last 4 months in total. Doctors would call, tell us Grandma's on her last leg. We would prepare to say our goodbyes and send her off. But then days would pass, and her health would stabilize a bit. We'd go home, only to get another call the next day, telling us that she was hours from death again. It was a toss-up to see if she remembered who we were when we'd bunk up with her again. Grandma's forgetfulness was silly to me. She used to call me Child when she couldn't remember my name. "Child, what are you doing in my room?" Because I was a little girl, not remembering who I wasn't as scary as when she'd forget who my dad, her son, was. He experienced the most of my grandma's memory lapses, and it really broke him apart. He would cry in the car on our way home from our visits. A few times my grandma attacked him, thinking that he was a stranger in her room. There was a lot of turmoil being passed around the adult that I was blissfully ignorant about. That being said, in retrospect, I was able to see my grandma change with an unbiased filter. Besides being as sick as she looked, in my mind, the other medical conditions weren't attributed to how she acted. Therefore, I wasn't skeptical when she whispered about the devil bird that landed on her windowsill. It was just her and I watching the morning news in her hospital room. My cot was pressed against the corner of the wall, right under the thick glass window, furthest away from the cords and IV bags that hung around my grandma's bed like plastic ivy vines. The view from my window looked out high above a smaller suburban city. Birds would land outside the window often, and my grandmother would admire them or pay them no mind. But this time, as we watched the morning news together, a bird landed on the window that she feared greatly. With a weak, raspy voice, she told me quickly, "Get away from the window." I did as she asked. The urgency in her eyes frightened me. When I got to her bedside, she would point my attention over to the window, the bird that was perched outside the glass. Its colorful body faced us, but its head drooped to the side, like it was trying to look down off the edge. With a trembling voice, my grandma whispered, "That bird is evil, and that's a devil bird." I'd never heard of a devil bird before, and I had no clue why my grandma was so afraid of it. Technically, we couldn't even see its face. To me, It just resembled the other birds that flew around the hospital. It just sat strange. I couldn't see anything that made the bird special apart from the others. From its position, you could see one of its eyes. It was exceptionally big and black, but I questioned if I was just wanting to see this exaggerated feature rather than actually finding one discernible from the other birds. It was also the only one up there, and so comparing the size and blackness of its eyes was, again, most likely exaggerated by the name my grandma had given it. She was lucid at the time, too, not silly, forgetful grandma. Her heart monitor spiked until the bird flew away. Throughout the day, when birds would land on the windowsill outside, I'd ask my grandma if they were also devil birds. She said, no, those birds are living. Devil birds are not. They're possessed corpses, allowed to fly again until their muscles wear away. The idea of possession was within my grasp, as I'd seen it referenced before in a show called Unsolved Mysteries. I asked how she knew the bird that morning was a devil bird. Its neck was broken, she tells me. Unfortunately, this back and forth was pieced together between many forgetful lapses that lasted until the day she did pass away. Later, when I'd ask my dad about the devil birds, his answer pivoted off her mental state. I've always wished that he could have been there when she told me all of this, or seen the bird, if only to see how lucid she was at the time. Even in her full-blown dementia, she never referred to another bird as a devil bird, and more birds would land on her windowsill all the way till the day she passed. She was right. None of them looked quite like the devil bird. I've always been nervously curious to see if my grandma's account of devil birds was real. Believing in this is also accepting the belief of possession being real, no matter at what size. So now I've put myself out there, told my crazy granny story. You're now obliged to tell me if she was really crazy after all. You know, crazy. My father died in 1982 when I was 8. I was an only child and I was daddy's girl. His death wasn't sudden as he was diagnosed with cancer in June and passed away in November. Even at an early age, I knew the permanency of death. My great-grandmother died a year prior to his passing, and my grandmother passed away in June 1982. I was in school when my dad died that morning. I was using the restroom. When I turned to open the stall door, I caught a whiff of aqua velva. For those who don't know, it was a popular aftershave in the 70s and 80s, and it has a very distinct odor. Well, that's what my dad wore, and I loved the smell of his cheeks. So when I caught the distinct odor, I was expecting to see him outside the girls' bathroom. I walked out and didn't see him, so I walked down the hallway hoping he was looking for me. When I finally went back to class, my teacher called me up to her desk and informed me that I'd been gone for about 15 minutes. She said, "It's 9:55. You left here at 9:40. I went back to my desk and tried to focus on school. I kept thinking about smelling that odor. At 10:30, my mom came to the classroom and my teacher went out to speak with her. After a while, my teacher came in, quietly got my coat and lunchbox, and walked me into the hallway. I didn't say anything to my mom, and when we got to the stairway landing, I asked if Daddy had died. She turned and stooped down to my eye level, and with tears in her eyes quietly said, yes. I asked her when he died, and she replied, at 9:45. I truly believe that he wanted to let me know that he was there in that bathroom, and it was his time to go. Every so often I'll catch a whiff of aqua velva for just a slight second, and I'd like to think that it's my dad checking in on me. My grandmother passed away last year, and my grandfather has been having a difficult time with the adjustment. A few weeks ago, I went to stay with him, hoping to help him develop a new routine, get the house in order. He lives in the mountains and doesn't have any neighbors, so we always worry about him being out there alone. When I arrived, his yard was overgrown. A large pile of trash bags were stacked beneath the carport, and the inside was well on its way to becoming a hoarder's paradise. I hired people to help with the trash and yard while I focused on getting the house in shape. I couldn't get a clear answer on what happened to his trash cans. They used to have 5 or 6, so I brought new ones. On the 4th night, we heard a noise in the carport while we were eating dinner. Figuring it was raccoons, I stood to go chase it off, but Pappy said to sit down and leave it alone. He's normally a very docile, slow-to-anger man, but he was serious about me not going out there. I tried explaining that something was creating a bigger mess for the contractors, but he only got angrier. Not wanting to upset him further, I resigned to cleaning the mess myself and finished my dinner. While I was doing dishes, Pappy went to bed, so I checked the damage in the carport. Whatever had been there was long gone, but it wasn't a raccoon. The bin lids had been ripped off the hinges, and the contents were strewn all the way to the tree line. The next morning, I asked Pappy if he had trouble with bears, and he said his problem is worse than a bear, that it's something unnatural. No matter what I asked, his answers became more cryptic. Ultimately, I concluded that he was in a very bad place emotionally and must have mistaken a bear for something else in the dark. His mind had turned it into some kind of monster. Just to settle him down, I promised to never go outside after dark, and I got started on the day's chores. On my next trip to town, I picked up some bear spray and heavier-duty trash cans with locking lids. They lasted 2 days. This time the bins were peeled open like sardine cans. When I talked to Pappy about it again, he told me a little more. He said he called it a wobo. And no, I have no clue where he got the name. I assume he made it up because I can't find anything about it online. Anyway, it made me worry about his sanity, so I told my parents, who said they would speak to him about seeing a doctor. Meanwhile, I focused on what I still considered to be a bear. I slept on the couch for a few nights in hopes that I would wake up if anything got into the trash. The theory was that it might not come back if it got sprayed one good time. When I finally had my chance, I cracked the back door open to see something huge, and it was tearing into the trash bags. I opened the door a little more to extend my arm, and the creature raised up to face me. It definitely wasn't a bear. It looked like a wolf standing on its hind legs, but it also looked wrong. I started spraying it in a panic, and it made an awful sound as it fled, but it didn't run like a wolf or a human. It was more like a kangaroo. I've never seen or heard anything like it. The next morning I told Pappy what happened, and he was notably upset. He said the wobo only comes during the summer months and never tries to get inside, but now I'd made it angry. He was certain it would come back for us. I stayed another week, brought new trash cans without further issues, but I was still nervous to go home. I've called Pappy every night since to make sure he's okay, and so far, the wobo has stayed away. Have you guys ever seen anything like this? Did I really scare it off? Or should I go back? My parents want to have us both committed, but I know what I saw. After my father died suddenly, I had to clean out his place and dispose of any of his things that we didn't want to keep. In his things was his cell phone. I got all the contacts out of it and turned the phone off for the last time. I put it in a drawer in my office. I spent the first week sort of in shock and planning for the funeral and settling his estate. At one point, I'd wondered why I hadn't felt that he was around me. About 5 minutes later, my phone rang. Caller ID showed it was my dad calling from his cell phone number. What? I just sat there in shock for a couple of rings trying to process it. I answered the phone, and there was nobody there. I rushed from my house to my office, and his phone was still in the drawer, still turned off. It was a couple of days later, and I was still trying to understand what happened. I finally mentioned it to my stepmother, my father's second wife, and she said she got a similar call at the same time on the same day. Too crazy. Hard to explain. Something insane happened, but I can't explain how. Last year, my brother Ian was killed during a home invasion. Some random guy charged into his house, broad daylight, and a week later, we were having his funeral. The intruder was high on meth, thought my brother was robbing him. It was all so stupid. But I'm not here to talk about the trial or my grief. I have a therapist for that now. I want to share what started happening most recently. First off, I'm kind of a crappy millennial. I'm 35, but I don't really do any kind of social media other than Reddit, and even that is just a collection of memes. No Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or Snapchat. I've never used any of them. I'm from a family of introverts, and my brother was no exception. He spent most of his time working offshore, and when he was home, he preferred being outdoors. This is all to stress that we're not the kind of people that you can just look up online, read about all of our intimate details and stuff like that. A few weeks ago, I got a message from Ian's Reddit account. It just said, "Kayla, are you there?" No one had his password. He barely used it. There's not a single post on his profile. We never even tried to get in. He never married or had children. He was just alone. What few friends he did have moved away after college. Still, I asked just to be sure. The reply was, "No, it's Ian." I assumed his account was hacked, and I tried to keep my temper as I explained my brother was deceased. The hope was that any decent person would have an ounce of sympathy and move on to someone else. But they stuck to their story and used an old nickname, one that no one had called me since we moved out of Florida. Over the next several days, they also told me the names of my family members, pets, everything. They knew everything, things that maybe 3 people in the world know. I confronted them all, but each seemed more confused than the last. Still, the messages continued. Then, I found myself participating as if it were Ian. At first I told myself it would be easier to catch the asshole, to find any tiny discrepancy in their facade. But then I got sucked into it for real. We would talk so naturally that it's like I forgot Ian was dead. Then the conversation would end, and the reality of it all would come crashing back. People can't message you from the dead, Kayla. But then, the same thing would happen the next day, and the next. Finally, I confided in a friend who concluded it was a random sicko getting off on screwing with the bereaved. That made more sense than any of my theories, so I took her advice and ignored the messages for 2 days. When I failed to respond, I received one saying, "I understand you need to move on. It's okay. I'll always be with you." My friend said that it was just another tactic, so I held strong. To take my mind off things, she invited me to a small concert the following night, and I agreed. That morning, I woke to find my inbox flooded with messages, warning me, begging me not to go. No one even knew about our plans. I didn't tell my friend about the newest DMs. They had gotten to me, and I didn't want to sound crazy. Instead, I told her that I wasn't feeling up to it after all, and I promised to go next time. That night, a drunk driver T-boned my friend on her way home. The truck hit the passenger side going over 70 miles an hour. The driver, pronounced dead on arrival. My friend, she'll be in the hospital for up to 6 weeks. The car is totaled, and it is very safe to say I would not have survived the crash had I been present. I don't know how to explain any of this. I've never believed in ghosts. I could have spent the rest of my life thinking I encountered a particularly skilled con artist. But what about the crash? How could they have known? Could it all be a coincidence? I never believed in those much either, but I feel insane admitting that I believe it was really Ian. I do believe in phone calls from beyond, and I speak from experience. Early one morning, way back in the landline days, I answered a call from an uncle in New York City who asked in an uncharacteristically quiet tone to speak to my mother. I told him that she had left for work, and he thanked me and hung up without leaving a message. I thought the call was strange, as my uncle was normally loud, very outgoing, and always interested in what was going on with me. A few days later, his wife reported him missing after having not seen him for a few days. Sadly, he had died of a massive heart attack on an NYC street without carrying any ID. It was only through the tireless effort of other relatives and us putting our heads together that he was ever identified. I'm absolutely certain the phone call was after his passing. Perhaps he didn't want to stay unidentified forever. This is probably the most insane feral thing I've ever witnessed in 42 years of living, and it all took place right behind my house, which is now my greedy ex-wife's house. Yep, she took everything. Fellas, take it from me and get yourself a prenup beforehand. That girl next to you is gonna leave you high and dry someday. Now, back when it was a simpler time and I was still allowed to live in my own fucking house, I had a backyard that led out to beach access. It was my sanctuary. The property of the backyard had been lined with agave plants and golden cane palm trees. On warm nights, when the wife was staying at her mother's and I had the house to myself, I'd smoke a cigar and sit on the lawn to watch the sunset through the canopy leading out to the beach. On a handful of occasions, I'd see 2, sometimes 3, very small, gnome-looking things dash between the trunks of the palm trees. Their running speed is the likeness of a cat, and all on 2 legs. As quick as they move, I've been able to see that they're running on 2 legs. They resemble little cavemen. It looks like they use palm leaves and other plants for clothing. I've never been able to get a picture of them because of how randomly and sudden their appearance is. They're always in groups. I've heard them running through the trees way before I could point my finger as to what it was I was actually making that noise. When I actually heard and saw these tiny men run by, I thought, well, I actually don't know what I thought. I knew what I had just seen, but I didn't believe that I had just seen it, if that makes sense. They gave me a year to question my sanity before showing up again. Now the quick scuffling of branches and sand in the bushes put me a little more on edge, but I became obsessed with seeing them again. The nights I was home alone, I'd stay up all night tracking their movements and shining a flashlight around my backyard. But fleeting glances as they ran from the light was all I'd ever managed to see. Until one unforgettable evening. The sun had just set. I was tired from work that day and wasn't planning on going out into the backyard that night. I also didn't want to hear my wife complain about cigar smoke in the house, so I went out to the back deck to enjoy a beer and a smoke. Further past the yard, I see an owl flying around in the sky. It looked as if it was eyeing something in the tree canopy, and its flight path keeps slowly drifting lower, closer to my yard. Then, the owl dives into the leaves of the palm trees and flies back out of the branches with one of those cave people in its talons. A second little person's trying to jab the owl with a small, sharpened object. It looked like they were desperately trying to knock their buddy loose, but the owl was huge compared to them. The little guy with the spear lost his grip and hurtled down through the canopy. I could hear its body snap the branches all the way to the canopy floor. The owl exits slow and labored, but there were multiple tiny spears stuck in its wings and back. Some fell out of its wings, but there were a few that looked deep. Then, mid-flight, the owl dispatches the struggling caveman into its talons. It didn't stand a chance against the aggressive pecking. The owl was biting at the tiny man's skull and upper torso, while holding it securely in its talons. The owl didn't stop, but eventually the body draped in the wind like a plastic bag as the owl flew away too far to see. It all made me really sick and sad to see. I felt really bad for these tiny people. It really messed with me seeing such visceral carnage on something that resembled a human. Albeit small, but closely resembled. Still don't know what they were, but I have to believe they feel pain and loss just like us. But until I'd told this story on things like wild, kooky cryptid forums, I've never had the means to talk about how much seeing it affected me. I could never even tell my therapist. I think there's a lot of shit that happens on Earth that people, more likely than not, think someone's gonna put me in a mental hospital if I tell them what I saw. And that's what I thought. Still do. That's why I'm talking to you instead of seeking help on capturing one of these creatures for evidence. Oh, and I'm not allowed 100 feet from the property nowadays either, so that's another reason I stopped searching for answers. I was with my mom when she'd gotten news that my Uncle Jake had gone missing off a boat in the Puget Sound. He had apparently gone overboard and he couldn't swim, so they told us they probably wouldn't find him alive. It had already been almost 2 days. That night, the phone rang. I stayed seated at the kitchen table while my mom answered. Her face went white as a ghost, and then she said in a tone that still worries me to this day, "Who is this?" And the caller hung up. I asked her who it was. She said she didn't know, and that it sounded like my uncle. The only thing that he said before hanging up was, "Help me, Jeannie. Please help me." My mom called her sister-in-law to tell her about the call, but she didn't answer. Later that same evening, she called my mom back, but she wasn't returning the missed call. She was calling to tell my mom they'd found my uncle's body. He'd washed ashore, likely dead for a couple of days. Two years before our 15-year-old daughter, Allie, died in a car accident, I had a dream that she would die in a car accident. In the years since the accident, our life has been turned upside down, but we also have experienced countless events involving Allie that brought us comfort. One night I was playing a word game on my iPad. I began a fresh game and waited for the new tiles to dispense. I was thinking of my daughter. When they did dispense, it stole my breath. There, in a perfect order, were just 3-letter tiles. A-L-Y. Coincidence? I didn't think so. I often dream of Allie where she's sitting by my side, yet I'm the only one who knows she's there. She's invisible to everyone else. She said that it has to be this way for reasons I can't understand. But she's always with us. My husband used to beg for a dream from Allie. He just wanted to be sure his baby girl was okay. One night he got something far more. I remember moaning in my sleep, a deep guttural moan. Only a bereaved mother understands. My husband said he looked at me to make sure I was okay, and in that moment, Allie's face was transposed onto mine. He got his wish. Some people believe after-death contact is evil. How can something that brings so much comfort be evil? It's been 10 years now, and Allie doesn't visit often, but I always know she's there. And that brings tremendous comfort to my broken heart. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. Thanks for joining me. Whether it's your first time or you're a regular, your support means the world over here. We've got brand new episodes every Friday night. Keep those eyes open for those deep sleep videos and, of course, double features. Subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. Big thanks to those who shared their stories, and a huge shout out to all of our patrons, whom we appreciate so very much. Tracy S, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, The Dark Cosmos, Marion T, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendon G, Paul T, Nicholas C, Lissane, Arlene F, Adrienne, and TF Parham. If you want to support The Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining our Patreon, patreon.com/thedarkesthour, or click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.